We recognize that this is an unprecedented situation with an overwhelming amount of demand by Canadians to get money as quickly as possible. We need to make sure we're getting that money out quickly, but also reliably to Canadians, and that means doing things that government hasn't done before and scaling up our processes extremely quickly.
Billions of dollars now one step closer to getting to Canadians whose lives, have been upended by the COVID-19 crisis. Hi there, and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. We want to welcome viewers watching this show on CBC Television in Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as the Maritime provinces. Here in the capital, after an all-nighter negotiation in the House of Commons, the federal government's coronavirus aid package has received royal assent. That unlocks $107 billion in financial help for Canadians, the biggest piece of which is the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. The CERB amounts to $2,000 a month for 4 months. Here's who qualifies, and this is really important. Canadians who have lost their job because of the COVID-19 pandemic, people who are sick, quarantined, or taking care of someone else who's sick, parents who have to stay home without pay to take care of kids who are out of school. Schools, of course, closed right across the country. And then contract workers and self-employed Canadians are also eligible. As for when you can apply, the feds say they hope to have the application portal up and running by April 6th, and Canadians should receive their benefit within 10 days of applying. Also today, the federal health minister took the significant step of making it mandatory for anyone returning to Canada to self-isolate for 14 days, effective at midnight tonight. Those who break that rule will face penalties. Here's a snapshot as well of the spread of COVID-19 in this country. There are more than 3,300 cases of coronavirus and 33 deaths linked to the virus. Globally, there are more than 450,000 cases. You can see the number right there on your screen, 460,000 now, and the death toll has officially topped 20,000. The COVID-19 aid package now totals $107 billion, as I mentioned. I want to circle back to that financial aid package. And I want to bring in Carla Qualtrough. She's the Federal Minister of Employment. She joins us now from the foyer of the House of Commons. Hi, Minister Qualtrough. Thanks for making time for us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I want to start off with the dollar amount, because when the government first announced this aid package, it was $55 billion in tax deferrals, $27 billion in direct aid. Today, that amount, that direct aid, increased quite a bit to $52 billion because your government has said the new benefit is more generous and it's going to be available to more people. Yeah. How many people, how many Canadians is your government estimating at this point in time, understanding that this is very fluid, but what are you basing those numbers on? How many Canadians do you think are going to need to access this?
Well, we don't know, Vashti. As you just said, this situation is so fluid and we don't really know how many Canadians are going to lose their job or not be able to work because of this COVID-19 crisis. But what we do know is there are 19 million workers in Canada, and 5.6 or 7 of those million people didn't have access to EI, sickness, or regular benefits. So we had to design a benefit that encompassed every single worker in our country because everyone is impacted by this pandemic.
So I'm just trying to get a sort of a clear assertion, because I think there are questions about, for example, how fast the money can get out. Is the technical capacity there to get the money out? Do you think, does the federal government think that millions of Canadians will be applying for this?
Yes, we do. And the reason we've moved to the system we've created now is because we recognize we needed a streamlined, automated system that would process hundreds of thousands, if not millions of applications quickly and fluidly, without human error possibilities, and without making it so complicated that Canadians would have to wait.
Okay, I want to ask you a bit more about the technical capacity there. I don't have to remind you, I know you're very familiar with the problems that happened with Phoenix. I want to use something that's maybe even a more specific comparison, and that is the EI system. We know that that system is already overburdened. It's now, I think, 929,000 was the number of applications. The Prime Minister said earlier today, since last week, 143,000 of those applications have been processed. That's about 15%.
Right.
If there's already issues with the system that exists, what can you tell people who are watching tonight and worried that they may face the same problems with this new program?
What I can tell them and assure them is this is actually not going to be processed through the EI system. This is a completely separate system that is a combination of EI resources and CRA resources that's completely automated and will be delivered through CRA. If you've applied for EI since March 15th, you'll be entitled to this new benefit, the CERB, or the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and you'll be automatically rolled into this new process. So it's not going to be processed through the EI system.
And so let me just make sure I understand this and that our viewers understand it. So it will be a totally different system that you're hoping will be up by April 6th, the government says, but it won't require exactly what EI does. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's already up. Like CRA already delivers checks and benefits and payments and collects money from Canadians all the time. So it was a natural place to go. It's the most robust system we have in the government of Canada and the most reliable way to pay Canadians quickly and reliably.
I take your point on the CRA system, but the portal itself is not up. And it was difficult to get an answer today that was the same from everyone who was being asked about the exact point at which that application portal might be up. I'm asking only because I know we're getting inundated with questions about when people can apply. I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is it that the April 6th is the earliest they might be able to apply?
No, the April 6th is our target date, and it looks to me like we probably will be able to do it sooner. But I can assure you that people who are EI eligible can apply now. If you apply today for EI because you're eligible for EI, that application will be funneled into the system and will be ready to go as soon as the system is up and running. For people who don't qualify for EI, you are going to have to wait till the portal's up. But let me tell you what the portal's going to ask you. It's going to ask you 2 or 3 things maximum. First of all, what's your social insurance number? Second of all, have you earned $5,000 in the past year? And third of all, are you no longer working because of a COVID-19 related reality? If the answers are yes, and if you have a SIN number, you'll qualify for this and you'll automatically be getting this benefit. The nice thing about it is it's 4 weeks, so you don't have to apply every 2 weeks, so the system won't be burdened with millions of applications every 2 weeks on a recurring basis. 4 weeks later, you're going to be asked a question. Are you still in the same situation you were 4 weeks ago? Are you still not working? If the answer is yes, you'll get another 4 weeks. That's for 16 weeks max.
Are you at all worried about the website, the ability to do that? I totally take your point on how that sounds way more streamlined. I do look, and I know EI is a more arduous process, I do look at that website. There have been issues even with the number of people applying there.
Well, and that's why we're collecting all the applications that haven't been processed since March 15th, and they will all be processed through the CRA. My hope and my intent is all the backlog of EI applications that are waiting since March 15th will all be processed up for and around April 6th. You know, I can't guarantee that, but that's the plan.
Okay, let me ask about what else might be coming down the road, because your government has often categorized this or qualified it as stage 1.
Yep.
The number one thing that we are hearing from when it comes to small business or groups that represent small business is the wage subsidy. So your government has already, as part of this package, announced a 10% wage subsidy up to a maximum of $25,000 per employer and for up to 3 months. Do you intend to increase that amount?
Well, as the finance minister and the prime minister have both said, nothing is off the table. We're looking at additional ways to support small businesses. The situation is so fluid. What was deemed sufficient last week simply isn't anymore. And that's why we actually announced $450 last week, and now our CERB is up to $500. We know Canadians are struggling. We know small businesses right now have access to enhanced work sharing programs through EI. We know they have this 10% payroll deduction, which may or may not be sufficient, and we're looking at that. And we know that the best thing for our economy coming out of this is businesses are still running. And part of the CERB's goal is effectively to act like a wage subsidy for workers. So you don't have to lose your job to get this benefit. You just don't have to be working. So if you're laid off, if you're furloughed, but you're still attached to your workplace, that's really good. That's really good for our economy. And we hope that employers are going to take the opportunity to keep their workforce attached as much as they possibly can while still giving them the support they need.
With respect, though, the subsidy that you announced, your government announced last week was, I know you're saying things have changed,
Yep.
but even at that point it was being criticized as too low. I'll point to some other jurisdictions: Sweden, 90% wage subsidy; Denmark, 75%; France, 84%; the UK, 80%; Norway, 80%; Ireland, 70%. It's a big difference, 70 to 90% versus 10%. I know that you and the Prime Minister are both saying nothing is off the table, but I think small business owners who are worried about meeting payroll in the coming days are wondering when they might know what is on the table. Can you provide a more specific timeline, Minister?
I can't know, but I can tell you we're actively having these conversations as we speak. Okay. I literally just got back. But what I can say is both the Finance Minister and myself consider the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit to be effectively a wage subsidy. So small businesses don't have to pay their workers, but they can still keep them.
Does that mean that you won't look at the possibility of an actual wage subsidy?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, as I said, I apologize. All I can say is nothing's off the table.
Okay, let me turn and ask about another significant announcement from your government today, and that is that the Quarantine Act will now apply to travelers who are coming back into this country and have been told that they should be self-isolating. Now they have to. Right. Why wasn't the Quarantine Act applied previously or earlier, given 1 million Canadians have crossed through the borders in the last week?
Well, like many of the measures we've put in place over the past week or two, everything is a stepped up. It's a process. Well, we've been telling Canadians for days, if not over a week now, that please, when you come back from vacation, go directly home, do not pass go, self-isolate. It's what's in the best interest of your family, your community, and your country. Today, it becomes law. Today, it is legally required that when you step off a plane in Canada, you go directly home. You'll be giving a quarantine notice. So if you do not comply, there'll be legal penalties, pardon me.
Why did you wait, Minister, though? Why did your government wait until those recommendations weren't being followed to make it the law? Why not preemptively do that earlier to make sure that all these people, these 1 million Canadians, were doing as you have asked?
It wasn't a matter of waiting until people didn't comply. It was a matter of it being the time now to do this. And we've taken step-by-step measures with respect to travel restrictions. And we got to the point where we really recognized it was time to do this, that Canadians had been listening, and it was time to basically lay the hammer down.
But I don't understand. Why is it time now and it wasn't 3 days ago?
You know, I can't tell you why it wasn't the time yesterday or today, but I can tell you that the decision was made by the COVID Cabinet Committee, supported by full Cabinet, to do it today.
And can I just ask for some clarification for people who are watching right now and wondering how this applies to them? First of all, if they are found not to be in compliance, what happens? What's the penalty?
Well, like I said, it is legally enforcing, and both Public Health Agency of Canada and Canadian Border Services will have various tools at their disposal to enforce this. So whether it will be spot checks, so we're going to get information from you and we're going to follow up and make sure you're at home. There could be fines, there could be other types of penalty. It depends on the kind of gravitas of the offense, obviously, but it's really it's a matter of resources. It'll probably be spot checks because we certainly can't check everybody. But at the end of the day, we are relying on Canadians to do the right thing here. It's just how it has to be. We all have to work together on this.
So the example, I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but the example you provided, let's say, of somebody who is spot checked, and then let's say somebody does follow up and they're not in their home, they're found to be at the grocery store. What happens to that person?
Well, I'm not actually sure because I'm not an enforcement officer, but I can tell you that my understanding is CBSA can impose fines, that CBSA can track people down and kind of require them to stay in their homes. But really, this is about sending a clear message that it's time for everybody to do the right thing because so many people have been, but not everybody. And stay at home, it's what you have to do.
If someone comes into Toronto and they are symptomatic or they are not doing what your government has instructed them to do, are they going to be told to self-isolate there?
That's a possibility, absolutely, yes. So Public Health Agency officials will be on site at the 4 airports that people will be coming into. If people are symptomatic, they'll be taken aside, they'll be assessed, and they could be immediately put in quarantine in their city.
Only if they're symptomatic?
Not only if they're symptomatic, I think it will depend on the situation of the person. If they're getting in a car and going to a place where they might be driving to, if they're going on another flight, I think the situation is fluid enough that we're still working out what exactly the officials would require.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, Minister Qualtrough.
Thank you too.
And effective at midnight tonight, travelers returning to Canada, with the exception of essential workers, will be subject to a mandatory 14-day isolation under the Quarantine Act. This new measure will provide the clarity for those re-entering the country about the essential need to self-isolate. Individuals who exhibit symptoms upon arrival in Canada are forbidden also from using public transit to travel to their places of self-isolation. They will also be forbidden to self-isolate in a place where they will be in contact with vulnerable people. Alternative arrangements for people in these circumstances will be made by the Public Health Agency of Canada.
Returning to Canada after midnight tonight, prepare to self-isolate for 14 days or else face some penalties. The federal government imposed the rule today through Canada's Quarantine Act. Essential workers are excluded. Is the emergency measure appropriate? What else should the government do to flatten the curve of COVID-19? Andrew Scheer is the leader of the Conservative Party. He joins us now from the House of Commons right here in Ottawa. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Good to have you back. Thanks for your time.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me back.
I do want to ask you, of course, about the emergency aid measures and what happened in the House of Commons last night. But let me start off with the Quarantine Act. Was it the right thing for the government to do?
Well, it's a little bit late. There are many calling for these provisions to be enacted much earlier. And again, it's another example of this government reacting very slowly to things. We called for the government to restrict travel from international destinations well before they actually did. In the early days of this crisis, they said that would be ineffective. We now know that's not true. And now they're enacting these new measures, while at the same time, many travelers don't know what to do when they land here. So they've delayed implementing this. They go into effect midnight tonight, and yet we still understand that there's no plan in place for travelers who have to land at one airport and then perhaps drive a long distance, for example, landing in Toronto and then having to get to Windsor or another community like that. So we're a little bit frustrated that there doesn't seem to be the details, even though they took so long to enact these measures.
When it comes to, for example, the case that you just laid out, someone that's landing in Toronto and has to go to Windsor, I asked Minister Qualtrough about that, and it does seem like there isn't sort of a very straightforward answer to that the situation might change, I guess, depending on which airport or if you have symptoms and that kind of thing. It looks like those details have yet to be worked out. What do you think should happen? Should there be, for example, should the government be providing accommodation for those people? Should there be a way to isolate them right away rather than make that drive to Windsor? What do you think?
Well, these are very important questions and something that we would have assumed they were working out while they were delaying imposing these measures. I suppose there's a number of options you could look at in terms of trying to find methods of travel that might be safe for people to use to protect drivers of different vehicles. That's one option. Putting people up in hotels is another. But when we're talking about 14 days to have people in those types of positions, that's going to be a big challenge both for the individuals and for the government response. There are a lot of people who were overseas when this crisis hit who tried to come home when they were told to. I've got lots of stories of constituents who are on hold with airlines for hours and hours, and so many of these people have just been caught out in these when these new directives go into place. That's why we do believe that there should be some type of accommodation made for those people facing those challenges.
So you do think that there should be accommodation if people come back?
Well, at least something to help them get through the first few hours or few days. Some type of mechanism to take that into account, and whether or not that's something that individuals can, share in the responsibility of that. Those are things that we believe. Again, the government should have looked at that. They say details to come. Well, that's fine, but except that it's at midnight tonight that the new provisions come into place. So it would have been much better to have the information provided at the same time as they're announcing these measures coming into effect.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second on the timing of the Quarantine Act in general. My guess is, or maybe not my guess, but you would assume that the government didn't act right away because they were hopeful that Canadians would comply with the message that provincial leaders and federal leaders have disseminated for the last week, which is if you do come back, you better self-isolate. Would it be understandable to a degree that the government would hesitate to impose legal penalties on people, just given the sort of severity of that?
Well, if the severity of the virus is such that it can be transmitted so quickly, then I do believe it was appropriate to enact these much earlier. Again, we called on them to close the border. The government said they didn't need to. A short time later, they had to reverse their position. Remember, the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers were saying restricting travel was not effective. So to date, their handling of things has been quite slow. It seems like they're always following what other countries are doing or have already done, instead of implementing measures that other countries model their response after.
I mean, they have argued, and I do want to move on to the financial stuff, but they have argued that they're basing those decisions on the advice of public health officials, right? Not that we've asked those questions of them as well, but they've said, things change and therefore our response will change as well.
Well, they are the ones that are held responsible. They are the government, they are ministers, they are tasked with making decisions. And if, as is the case, the spread of this virus is much easier when people are coming back from overseas, when we see spikes in countries around the world, and then the opposition says, well, why don't you at least restrict travel from those countries, and this government doesn't act, well, then they have to be held accountable when it turns out that they should have done that much earlier. And that's our role in all of this, is to hold this government to account, to make sure that they fix the shortcomings in their response.
Let me ask you just about that, because that's what unfolded overnight and prior to that in the House of Commons. When we had you on the program last night, you said that you wanted the two things totally separate. The measures that they had in there about sort of more powers for the finance minister to respond to this, what's going on, and the financial aid package. At the end of the day, it wasn't completely separated, but there were some changes. Why were you okay with the final product?
Well, again, our preference would have been to have quickly dealt with the financial assistance. We could have done that in a couple of hours in the middle of the day, and then we could have had a longer conversation on the new tools the government was trying to write for itself. Because of our position, because of our principled stance and our refusal to sign over a blank check, we were able to get many concessions from the government in terms of more specifically defining where they could spend money, eliminating their ability to change taxes without parliamentary approval. We've built in sunset clauses so that these new measures expire in September instead of December 2021. And we've put in a mechanism that the Finance Committee can not only oversee all this new spending, but actually recall the House of Commons if we believe that there's been an abuse. So with those safeguards in place, we decided to allow the legislation to be introduced, and ultimately it passed very early this morning.
I know that that your party has advocated, along with some organizations that represent businesses, for an increase to the wage subsidy, which currently sits at 10%. The minister we just had on, the Prime Minister, all said that that is something that they're considering in the coming days. In any of your conversations, have you received any sort of timeline? And if you could put a timeline on when that should happen, that increase should happen, what should it be?
Well, there's two things we're calling for, and the timeline must be very quickly, but must be very quick, because businesses and workers who work in those businesses are experiencing this in real time. So the wage subsidy, we believe, should be raised, but we also recognize that many of these businesses just aren't even open at all. They're not paying any wages because it's, if they're a restaurant that has closed their doors, waiters and waitresses and cooks aren't getting shifts. We recognize that what's required now is that there are jobs for people to go back to when the health component of this crisis is over. That's why we've called on the government to refund the GST that they've collected from small and medium-sized businesses, so that that necessary cash injection can be made to keep those businesses afloat while they're not able to open the doors, so that people actually have a job to go back to.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thanks very much, Mr. Scheer. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
That's Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.